I actually titled this talk, "You Have to Go the Way Your Blood Beats." That's a James Baldwin quote, the African-American activist. And my heart's beating. So, it's kind of nice when you get up here, you can feel it beating. Yours was a very grounded story, Anita. I'm kind of going to fly a bit higher and in a different way, but I hope what I say resonates. Quite recently, I was driving home from a pretty wonderful weekend, 2 hours outside of Cape Town, and had a beautiful weekend in a forest. And as I was driving into Cape Town, I don't know how many of you have ever driven into Cape Town or flown in, we were going along a road by the side of a huge area called the Cape Flats. Up to 1 million people living in urban slums. And we got stopped because there were all these vans pulling up, and people were rebuilding their homes with the corrugated iron and the cardboard. And we were sort of sitting there going, wow, a community's probably just burned down and they're rebuilding, or some new land's maybe being allocated for them to build. And then as we got halted, as the traffic built up, we could smell the sewage coming in from the sewage plant right next to the Cape Flats urban slum area, and I actually started to feel sick. And it was one of those shaking moments, when you've been in bliss, you've just had a beautiful weekend, and you suddenly become aware again of your privilege. And there was a deep sense of shame that I had just had a good time and I was heading home to a nice little apartment, and yet here was this other reality. And I, moved from shame, as we should quickly, to a renewed sense of responsibility. Like, what can I, as a community development person, offer in this world? And then that sense of responsibility was overwhelmed by the sense of scale, because I was going to say effing, but I get told in South Africa, they train me not to swear. It's bloody overwhelming. And our humble methodology feels very inadequate. But I was shaken, and this was just a few weeks ago. The point is, she said some important things. She says, we're asleep. Actually, I'm not suggesting this group's asleep. It's probably one of the more awake groups. That we're disconnected. And her provocation is for us to be shaken and to be opened up to one another. So in a nightclub, she wants to do that. Well, we're not in a nightclub. But I am certainly aware that if we don't leave this conference shaken, then we've missed something, that we've achieved little or nothing. It means that our thinking, our practice, maybe has become, what did she say? Like old people, ossified. So you young people, check out the old people and make sure our thinking hasn't become ossified. I'd certainly like to add stirred to shaken. I'd certainly hope that we leave this conference shaken and stirred. I'm tempted to say stirred into more action, but actually I'm not convinced we need more action. Maybe too much action is what's undoing the world, so we need to think about what shaken and stirred actually means. But how can we be shaken and stirred like I was in Cape Town, or sustain the shaking? What words and images shake and stir us in a world that's weighed down with images and awash with words? We get a powerful image that we saw recently with children being separated from adults at a border. And it shakes us, but we move on. The next image. So how can we be shaken and stirred that we sustain our work? And our work being our individual and collective work. I've been grappling with this for weeks. And in trying to shake us, or maybe, because whenever we write, we're actually trying to shake ourselves, I was tempted to read you Allen Ginsberg's famous poem, How. I don't know if any of you have ever read Ginsberg? The older generation? Yeah? The old Beat generation lovers? With those wonderful opening lines to that amazing poem that says, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. And we kind of have to ask ourselves, what's destroying our generations? Maybe Facebook and Twitter and the endless connection. There's really disconnection. And then maybe we push on to the scream within Howe against Moloch, because Ginsberg talked about Moloch. Moloch, the incomprehensible prison. Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone. Moloch, in whom I sit lonely. So Moloch is the kind of symbol of the machine world that was then dominating. But we could add, because we live in the world of Matrix, not Moloch, we could add Moloch in its digital veil, because I suspect we face many more dangerous things than machines and concrete now. But those images of prisons, machinery, oil, stone, the loneliness of modernity, and the now new metadata of manipulations that are so alive, we see Moloch in its all-consuming consumption of our world. Moloch, as machine and concrete, fused with the matrix, a dense web of howling echo chambers, the manipulations of democracy and new oligarchs. How do we, as community workers, talk and think of justice, love, community and development in such a context? How do we remain unsettled and therefore reach with a new passion of the unknown? What is it to be community development workers in this new era? We really need a passion to kind of touch that. So grappling with this, I also don't want us to leave this conference settled with knowing what community development is, as though we know it, that we've got a packaged thing, assembled, taught, defined. I don't want us to leave this conference settled that we know what community development's role in this world is right now and what our responsibility is. It's not to say I want us to leave confused, but like Simone's words, I'd love us to be shaken such that we're in real conversation, unsure, curious, actually more than curious, but to be active in the mode of what Jacques Derrida, the great French philosopher, called the passion of not knowing. Because Derrida argued, once you know, you're not interested anymore. It's only the passion of not knowing that keeps you curious. And so I'm desperately hoping that we're in this conference passionately unsure, but wanting to know what our responsibility is, because then we will really reach out to one another. So in thinking about our responsibility as community workers, though, I do want to offer a couple of things. First is a method framework. Obviously, I took this opportunity. Anthony Kelly and I are launching this book tomorrow, Participatory Development Practice. And in that book is the offering of a method framework that's been taught across Australia for many, many decades to help community workers think. And I just thought, well, I'll share this framework as a way of thinking about this conference and its inquiry. There's 5 elements to this framework. The first, the implicate component. And the implicate is asking the question of all community workers, are you here in your skin, alive to the way your blood beats? Referring to that James Baldwin quote. That is, to not be here mimicking others, not to be here meeting other people's expectations, but to come here with your powerful sense of your story and in deep dialogue with others. So are you in your own skin? That's the first component. Because any community worker knows if you go into a community not in your own skin, you won't be there, and people will know. The second component of this framework is the micro method. We call the micro method the component of reaching out for dialogue in individual one-on-one conversations. And every community worker knows that's the heartbeat of the work. The relationships that start one-on-one, real dialogue. And I guess the practice challenge here in this conference is, are we reaching out to one another in real conversations? How do we get to be with one another, not just bringing our agenda, this is what I want to get from you, but listening to one another, being willing to be shaken by the stories of one another so we move into new places. The third component of the framework is the meso method. So this is the group practice. Every community worker knows you don't just work one-on-one, you then work in groups. It's the engine room of community work. So we step into many groups into this. We step into many groups in this conference. And I would just urge us to be in those groups in the real discipline of dialogue, which is to be really appreciative of what we can learn from one another, but also critical of what each other's saying. The fourth component of the framework's the macro method, because we know groups are not enough in communities. We need people's organisations. Now, I don't suspect we're going to form people's organisations in this conference, but what we can do is step into spaces of building partnerships with one another, getting to know which people's organisations are here and understanding their work. And then fifth part of the framework is the meta method. The meta method is, it's not enough just to have people's organisations. People's organisations need to be linked together in alliances, federations, networks to do the meta work of regional, national, or increasingly the big work of the local, global. And of course, this is opportunities for each of us to understand and meet other meta practitioners and link our local work to one another. So that's the framework, and I really hope we kind of take this opportunity to meet one another in those different ways. And I don't want to say anything more about the method other than the implicate, because I stand here with you with my blood beating in my skin, and I want you to think about your story and your blood beating. Because what is it for a white male to stand here? Luckily invited by a bunch of Irish women, so it's okay. But I am here. Mind you, my identity is not just a white male. Some 12 months ago, with the death of my 98-year-old grandmother and previously my 104-year-old grandmother, I again dug into the archives, because that's what we do in those big moments, huh? I learned afresh that I'm not just come from an English farming background with Viking ancestry. Westoby is actually Westoby, the village of the West in Norway. I discovered that my great-grandmother has both French and Irish ancestry, that she'd been a suffragette and the mayor of the local working-class borough of Greenwich in London, one of the first female working-class mayors. And it was so exciting to know more of where I came from. It gave me more of a sense of my life as a community worker, to really understand that I'm not just from a lineage of farmers, even though farming is really important, but I had Labour feminist blood flowing within. And knowing this part of my story gives more depth to my life, a deeper kind of granularity to the story that I inherit and I reshape. Maybe that's why I love coming to Ireland. It's in my blood. And with that background, I'm an Australian and I live on Jagera Turrbal country, the two Indigenous nations upon which Brisbane sit, and there are a whole bunch of us here from Brisbane. And we give respect to the elders of Brisbane, as I do to the original owners and ancestors of this land. Now, I just tell that story, maybe rather than at the beginning, at that point, to illustrate in some ways the implicate component of the work. And it's to ask each of you, do you know your story? Are you here in your story? Because that's when you come in your full power and enter into real dialogue with others. So I come to the end, because I think I've got about 2 or 3 more minutes. Some weeks ago, I was shaken on that Cape Town road. And what shakes and stirs in each of us is what's important. In that shaking and stirring, what's our responsibility in this historical moment as community workers? In some ways, it's a question of, like Alice in Wonderland, how far do we want to go down the rabbit hole? Or alluding to that wonderful movie again, The Matrix, do we want to take the red pill and really see what's happening in the world? Or should we take the blue pill and go back to sleep? I'm very tempted to go back to sleep because it's just all very hard. Turn Netflix on. But in thinking about communities development's response in the world right now, I do want to say a few things, but I don't want to speak to abstracts or universals or to make a case of what I think is important, because that would deny each of you your story, your context, and the principle of diversity. You're all in your story working out what is important for you in community development in the context of our world. But from my singular journey as 30 years of community work, here are my quick thoughts. I've spent many years nurturing place-based communities of hospitality within inner city Brisbane, urging individuals and households to be supports and friends with those who are marginal in their neighbourhoods, people suffering mental health, experiencing domestic violence, and so many others who are invisible. Part of our work, despite all the social justice campaigning issues, still needs to be that. It's the community building spaces of hospitality in neighbourhoods where people are so disconnected and alone. Second, much of my community work's been about supporting refugee communities or building communities of support and solidarity around refugees and asylum seekers. And in that world of mass migration, this seems to be an imperative for our work, to stand with those who are stateless, trying to get over the wars that we are building. Third point, for 10 years I've worked in the Pacific region with Indigenous communities, grappling with how to survive the onslaught of modernity. And there's such a need for platforms in those communities to think about their version of the good life, along with how to maintain governance systems that enable their self-reliance. And here our work is crucial in aligning with the dual struggles of ongoing colonisation and the need for decolonisation, which are both at work at the same time. And we need to be right in there supporting those communities. Fourth point. For 24 years, I've worked on and off in South Africa, and using the Indigenous word, deadly. There is such a deadly need for transformative conversations around identity politics of race, class and gender. South Africa is coming apart. The United States is coming apart. How do we do identity politics in a way that acknowledges the pain of exclusion, enables difficult conversations, but also builds connection? I think it's one of the issues of the day, and we're not doing it very well. Maybe in Ireland you are. In Australia we're not. Fifth point. I've spent recent 5 years working in Uganda with local NGOs doing popular education and community organising amongst communities whose commons are being enclosed. By that I mean Lake Victoria being cut up and handed over to fishing corporations, forests being handed over to multinationals that are locking up forests to then do climate. My brain's just lost it. Carbon trading. Thank you, Linda. She knows the work. We're right in the middle of a battle between commoning and corporatising and the loss of the commons, and we really need to be in there. Sixth point. There's 9. I've recently been in inquiry with some colleagues around community development's response to malignant forms of populism, fueled by rage and anxiety, that truly threaten to undo our world. And I think we've heard a lot about that in the conference already. I think everything's under threat that we've taken for granted, so this is crucial. Seventh point. I'm part of a national network in Australia exploring and prototyping new social and solidarity economy initiatives. Community development has to be at the table of this global movement. How do we not just react to hyper-capitalism, but how do we rebuild new economies? We can do politics, but if we don't do economics, we're pissing in the wind. Finally, I'm on a journey with some colleagues around the world about the potential for community-owned energy to democratise energy. And also, how do we engage with those corporate renewable energy companies to ensure that there is genuine community benefits? It's a space of intriguing ethical and methodological dilemmas, but we also need to be there. Many people have argued you can't have political sovereignty without economic sovereignty, and you can't have economic sovereignty without energy sovereignty. So energy takes us right to the heart and soul of how we build our communities and nations. So if we're not involved, not all of us, it's all our own journeys, but if we're not at the table of community-owned energy and the democratising of energy, we're probably missing the boat of the biggest transition, what we call just transitions in modern history. So, with those notes, that's been my journey, the journeys I'm still on. Each of you are on your precious journeys, and we come to this place in a mutual learning, profoundly challenging place. I'm deeply grateful to be here. I hope that we are all shaken and stirred in dialogue with ourselves and others to discern our responsibilities and what Aboriginal people call our dreaming. Thank you.